welcome to Solo's Just Week 3. I'm Squirrel Patrol, joined by JM to win from 1 week season. JM, I was furious last week because in week 1, I listed Alec Pierce as like my touchdown call on my Sunday morning show. And I said, somebody's going to win the Millie playing like Anthony Richardson, but like with a different wide receiver like Alec Pierce and just running it back with Joe Mixon. That was exactly what won the Millie Maker on FanDuel in week 1. I didn't have Anthony Richardson, Joe Mixon, and Alec Pierce on the same lineup on FanDuel. So last week, we were talking about Marvin Harrison Jr. during the show and Alvin Kamara. And then Sunday morning, I said, Marvin Harrison Jr., that's my pick for a touchdown in week 2. And I just made sure I just jammed my lineups full of Alvin Kamara and Marvin Harrison Jr. Ended up winning the $200,000 prize on FanDuel in the Blitz with that combination. So it was a big week. I was glad I kind of had that experience week 1. Glad I, learned from it in week 2. How was your week 2? And, what do you have as any initial thoughts on week 3?
Man, I love hearing that. Success for sharp people who are good people is always fun. I had my whole thesis was around how plus EV that Rams offense was last week. And I talked this week kind of in some winner circle stuff and other stuff on OWS about that was probably the most plus EV setup we'll see all season, in that if we could have played out that slate 100 times, focusing heavily on the Rams would have made you, in the correct way, would have made you a lot of money. Marvin Harrison Jr. was my 4th highest owned wide receiver. Malik Neighbors was my highest owned wide receiver. Had a ton of those pieces that all hit, but the Rams was my central thesis for that week. So some weeks are like that. And then that's another one of those weird things, right? Is when we shift our mind from predicting what will happen to understanding probabilities, I know there's going to be weeks this season where my edge is much smaller than week 2 and I make a bunch of money. And there's going to be weeks like week 2 where my edge is bigger, but that one thing just doesn't break my way. So that was last week for me. It was actually a really great week minus the Rams. And then that was, everywhere on my roster. So man, we turn the page. This is a super unique week, isn't it? It's like pricing is tight. There's no good value. And I think there's some unique components about, for any of you who sometimes listen to my other stuff, my Angles podcast this week, I go through a whole history of the NFL coaching and schemes over the last several years and how we've gotten to here and how NFL offenses are playing this and what it means for DFS. But it's just really unique, right? How the passing is so far down and wide receiver stats are so far down, but most backfields are split backfields. So it's not like we can just be oh, cool, go to the running backs. And there's a lot of unique components this week. And I think that recognizing that you got to target extreme scores, price considered. So usually I always say anybody who gets 30 points is valuable, regardless of what you paid for them. But there's some unique components this week that mean that if you spend 8,400 and you get 27 points, it's probably not going to do much for you. And there's a lot of 5K and 6K guys who actually could go for 27 points, right? And that might be one of the ways to build this week. So it's a really unique week.
Yeah. So I think we're viewing the slate somewhat similarly. I was going to say, the Rams injuries from last week kind of lead us right into the big injuries, that we're seeing this week. To me, this slate breaks down. There's 2 things that just jump out at me. One, we're hitting the injury peak, it seems, pretty early this season. And hopefully it's the peak because you just see guys dropping like flies. I think maybe 10% of the picks from season-long drafts and best ball drafts, 10% of the first 3 rounds have serious injuries already and are going to miss significant time. But then that creates in DFS when pricing has already come out. Sometimes that creates mispricings. So we have injury situations we need to react to this week, and I think the San Francisco Rams game is maybe the game that's going to impact the most. And then it's also a week where I just see a huge amount of differentiation between games I want to target and games I don't. And I think a lot of it comes down to there's teams I want to target and teams I don't. And teams are running more, passing less. And I think some teams have just accepted that we're going to win games running the ball. This, kind of back to the 90s. We're actually seeing less passing yards per game than any season, I think, since 1992 or 1995. I think it's 1992. And some teams are just running the ball. and they're going to have a split backfield as well. And that just makes it like there's nothing we can do for DFS. It makes it such an unappealing environment for DFS, especially when you have two of those teams matching up. But when you have some teams that aren't doing that and they're matching up, suddenly it's like a very appealing environment. And like we have some environments this week. We have New Orleans New Orleans and Philly that are playing each other, like, and two high scoring offenses. We have Detroit and the Cardinals. There's another big game, and it's like you have these games I want to focus on, and then we have games that I just don't want to touch at all.
Yeah, and I think that's also key. Is week one, you could score like 160 points and finish pretty high in tournaments, right? Last week, that wasn't happening. I was talking DraftKings, Jordan. That wasn't happening. You're finishing. You had to get up into like the 200, but that's because Kamara was 4% owned and he hit. Marvin Harrison was 4% owned and he hit. Neighbors was like 20% owned and he hit. So like the highest end score was up where we typically see, but like you could also finish like 70th percentile with a what would typically be kind of a bad score, right? So the separation is greater. And I think that's going to keep going. And that's why I think that what I touched on in the Angles podcast was so interesting. I know you'll enjoy it if you get a chance to listen, but it's like just the development of how the cat and mouse game between offenses and defenses has led us to a very unique point right now. And understanding where we are really allows us to understand where to go. And so, yeah, I see the same thing as you. Like the players, it's all about right now. It's like who can separate in terms of players, and then in terms of game environments, who can separate, because there's going to be like, there could conceivably be like maybe Texans and Vikings gets up to like 45 points, right? And then like 8 games at 42 and below for totals. And then maybe 2 or 3 games go for 55 plus. And so it's like those games, getting on those games is going to look, oh yeah, you needed 215 to win this week. But also like maybe you could finish in the money with 160, which is just a weird type of situation. Obviously we're going for wins. So we want to think about like, what will those winning rosters look like?
Right. And so I think the week starts with the 49ers, who are not necessarily in one of the highest total games, but they are big favorites facing the Rams, like the Rams team that has been ravaged by injuries so far already this season. And Jordan Mason is probably going to, I think he's projected for 40% ownership. I think it's going to be higher, certainly in like single entry and in single entry and in small, the smaller field contests. I think he's going to see massive ownership. I have a hard time. Last week, I was actually kind of down on Jordan Mason. I say, he doesn't catch passes, so he has a chance to put up a dud. This week, his rushing prop is about 15 yards higher than any other running back on the slate. I think Jonathan Taylor might be next, or it might be Josh Jacobs are next with like 77 yards. His rushing prop's like 92.5. He also has second best odds, for an anytime touchdown behind Alvin Kamara, and he's still just not priced up that high. It's like 6,200. I was like trying to talk about maybe Jonathan Taylor as an interesting pivot. I'm like, no, like Jonathan Taylor is projected way less, for $1,000 and is $1,000 more expensive. And the situation now is we may not have Deebo Samuel. Well, I think we definitely don't have Deebo Samuel. We may not have George Kittle. It's like looking unlikely. I think Adam Schefter said unlikely to play. Any thoughts? I guess starting with that game. I know you're always a big Brock Purdy fan. Any thoughts on maybe like a Brandon Ayuk, Brock Purdy like pivot instead of Mason, or do we just have to eat the Jordan Mason chalk?
Yeah, so Jordan Mason, there's paths to failure, right? You're 92.5 rushing prop. That means half the time he's finishing below 92 yards, and he's going to get 1 target probably, right? So then you're talking like there's a pathway to him having 10 DraftKings points at massive ownership, but also he's a really sharp play. I think it's last week I played him on 40% of my rosters, but also made it clear like his range of outcomes was like 8 to 30 points, right? And I think that it's important to recognize that remains the case this week, and maybe against this Rams defense, who really, they've looked bad outside of Jared Verse, like even Kobe Turner and some of these guys that were really up and coming guys, like they just don't look good across the board. Things can change. Obviously, it's early in the season, but yeah, I think it's a super sharp way to go. But I think it's also important to recognize that the range of outcomes is still broad there, right? There's some other cheap running backs, right, that we can consider as well. Obviously Charbonnet, but also like DeAndre Swift on a Bears team that can't run against a Colts team that can't stop the run. Tony Pollard, who's gotten 19 and 22 touches so far, and should see around that range again. So like Pollard could get 22 touches with 4 catches, and Mason gets 25 touches with 1 catch, and maybe Pollard outscores him. But yeah, Mason's, I think, super sharp. There's no reason to argue against him. And then in terms of Purdy, I've looked at a lot of these quarterbacks down in that price range, and it's like there's probably a lot of these guys who are going to go for 20 points or like 18 to 24 points, or like Geno could go for 18 to 24, Purdy could go for 18 to 24. But then it's like we're talking about trying to find the scores that separate, right? You haven't touched on this game, Ravens and Cowboys, where like the Cowboys scored 30 or more points at home, including playoffs, in 8 out of 9 games last year. Dak and CeeDee Lamb combined for more than 4x their combined salary in 4 out of 8 games at home last year, and went for 5x in 2 out of 8 games last year. Like Dak can put up 35 points, right? Lamar could put up 35 points if that game goes that way. Jared Goff can put up 30. Kyler can put up 30, 35. So like I am kind of looking at like, is the little bit of savings down to Purdy or Geno or one of these guys for 20 to 22 to 24 points? Like, is that worth it? So that's kind of how I'm looking at those situations. And I'm going to trend more toward basically the quarterbacks in those other 3 games: Carr, Hurts, Dak, Lamar, Kyler, and Goff.
I think you brought up 4 things I wanted to talk about. So first, I did actually want to caveat the Jordan Mason thing. So I think he's the 11th most expensive running back on DraftKings, which is just absurd. Like he should be the first or second or third. On FanDuel, I think he is like the 3rd or 4th most expensive running back. I think he's up at 8,300. On FanDuel, we also have an interesting situation because Cam Akers is 4,000, and I think Dameon Pierce is doubtful. I think it was just right before we came on the show. Dameon Pierce doubtful, or maybe it's Dameon Pierce out, Joe Mixon doubtful, or vice versa. But Cam Akers could be the guy along with the pass catching back. Dare
Agumbawale, who outsnapped him 20 to 13 last week and didn't fumble last week like Cam Akers did. So I mean, I will throw that out there.
Okay, but yeah, but on FanDuel you've got like 4,000, which is a more significant savings than it is on DraftKings. And then you also have Carson Steele, who is, because they have the Sunday night game.
Oh yeah, they got the Sunday night game on FanDuel. That's right.
And so just for the people playing FanDuel, because we can sometimes get to know, you'll have more FanDuel talk. If you put in Steele and Akers at 4,000 and 5,000, I think, into your running back positions on FanDuel, you suddenly have a hard time spending all your salary. And that actually is much different than DraftKings. DraftKings, you mentioned the mid-range wide receivers. We have a bunch of guys at 6K that could put up big scores. Devontae Smith is somebody that like jumps out at me. Just a bunch of wide receivers in the 6K range. They could do really well, but that's leaving the higher priced wide receivers almost underowned. Almost unowned. We're seeing like single digit ownership projections on CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill. Amon-Ra St. Brown is just over 10% projected ownership, and you never know, like within a few percentages, how things are going to actually end up. And so I think there is like an interesting strategy of maybe trying to get up some of these guys. And you specifically mentioned, CeeDee Lamb and the Cowboys and Ravens game. And that's actually an interesting game because I got that game ranked like 3rd on my list of games, right? Like there's the Philadelphia New Orleans game. I think that's going to see heavy ownership. You also, have the Cardinals game, which I think will still see some heavy ownership. Maybe not. I don't know. I still like getting to like Marvin Harrison Jr. and Kyler Murray. But you also have this Baltimore-Dallas game, which is really interesting because I think this game, this game could easily be the highest scoring game of the week. You have Lamar Jackson, you have Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb. It's just an awkward game to stack. And I've been thinking about that game a lot over the last day or so, that I want to get to more of this game. I just don't know how. like in my head, I want to get to it. But like I end up like trying to stack like Dak Prescott with like Isaiah Likely and, because Lamar is so expensive, CeeDee Lamb is so expensive, that it's tough to get them on the same roster. And then you end up going to Dak and then trying to run it back with a Baltimore piece. I guess let's talk about that game. Any specific thoughts on that game?
Yeah, a lot. I actually have that game ranked 1st, and that's just thinking about I think about like this. Cardinals and Lions is going to hit like its median output is going to be higher than the median output for Ravens and Cowboys, right? But it's like it's 95th percentile or even 90th percentile outcome gets beat by the Ravens Cowboys 90th percentile outcome. And so there's a world in which Ravens Cowboys disappoints, Lions Cardinals hits, and it's like, Ravens Cowboys out of sight, out of mind because it just didn't hit, right? Like Cardinals or Eagles Saints, right? That's the game you had to have. But there's also a world in which like Eagles Saints hits at like its high end, Cardinals Lions hits at its high end, and Ravens Cowboys hits at such a high end. It was like, oh, you couldn't win without that. Like this could like jump over leapfrog those games. And so yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have pretty equal shares of all three, but I just like, to me, it's like this is the game that you could literally just end up in a situation where you couldn't win without it. What's really interesting, you bring up the Ravens thing, right? It's the situation that Lamar Jackson takes a lot of points away from the rest of his teammates with his legs, and then Zay Flowers takes away a lot of points from his teammates, but doesn't actually have a high enough ceiling to justify his price tag. So it's like Zay Flowers has scored 20 plus points in 6 of his last 9 games, but he's never topped 24.9 points. He's only topped 22 points one time, right? So it's like he keeps stealing away points from his teammates. But you can't really justify playing Zay Flowers at his price tag. And then, his teammates aren't getting enough points. So yeah, I think there's justification just to understanding the way that the Ravens offense functions and being like, okay, I'm going to go Dak and CeeDee Lamb, and then like get in like Trey McBride and Jamison Williams and Rashid Shaheed, and like pull pieces from these other games, right? I think that's viable because Dak could go, and when CeeDee Lamb goes for 40 plus, Dak goes for 30 plus. Like they're gonna go together. So yeah, I like that. And then I'm gonna have some Lamar. I'm gonna have some tight ends from this game. Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, but I think it's also viable to do it without the bring back, and I think that's a really interesting way to play it.
Interesting. So you mentioned one of my favorite plays this week. One of the guys that got tagged, Rashid Shaheed. I'm really interested in this like $5,000 range of wide receivers, and Brandon Cooks from this game, is from the Dallas game, is right in there. But we're going to see really heavy ownership, I think, in the $6,000 range, like Chris Godwin, Chris Olave, Brandon Ayuk, especially if George Kittle is out. But there's like a really good like $5,000 range as well, like Tank Dell, Rashid Shaheed, Jackson Smith, Njigba. Brandon Cooks probably wouldn't be a player that I would play outside of some kind of stack with Dak Prescott and from the Dallas-Baltimore game. But I guess any thoughts on those wide receivers in the mid 5,000s?
Yeah, I think it's totally viable to literally. So if you spent 5,000 actually, if you spent 8,000 at defense and tight end, isn't Brock Bowers exactly 5,400? Like the Bears are 2,600. You spend 8,000 and get the Bears and Brock Bowers. You have 6,000 per position left over, right? Well, Jordan Mason 6,200, Charbonnet's 6K, Pollard's 5,900. Like all these quarterbacks at 6K, all these wide receivers down here. Like there's definitely a pathway to that winning tournaments and putting up 230 points, and like the people who pay up if none of the high end wide receivers go for more than 30, like none of those teams are winning a tournament because all the value you're having to get down to get to those guys is so thin, right? So I think that mid-range is probably the most plus EV way to build. I really like the Dak and CeeDee, so I'm going to have like a chunk of that. I'm going to have some Jefferson and Sam Darnold this week in large field play. Dak and CeeDee consider on like single entries, 3 max stuff. But yeah, no, I think this mid-range is really interesting. And you keep kind of leapfrogging over Jamison Williams, and I think the field is doing the same thing. To me, I'm like, this dude has 20 targets through 2 games. He is so central. He should be priced at 6,800, and he's not. And he's in a great game environment. So he's another one where it's like, oh man, this guy can go for 30 points in this spot. So yeah, there's a lot of guys here who could go for 25 to 30. And I think that hunting this range is a super sharp way to play this week.
For the record, I have 3 wide receivers tagged. One of them is Jameson Williams. So Jameson Williams, Rashid Shaheed, and Marvin Harrison Jr. again. Yeah, I think any of those 3 guys could make a splash. And if you played Survivor NFL the first 2 weeks, good chance you might be part of the over 60% of people who have been eliminated. Don't fret, you can start up a brand new Survivor contest starting week 3 on Splash. Splash is available in 34 states and is leading in peer-to-peer fantasy and betting contests. Join us at splashsports.com/RotoGrinders. Compete against our RotoGrinders experts community in another Survivor Revival tournament week 3. We also added a NFL DFS Pick'em or a Fantasy Tiers contest. Check it out for yourself at splashsports.com/RotoGrinders. So, you mentioned trying to like find value and, and the different pricing, once you put in like Jordan Mason into your roster and then hitting that mid range. I feel like we should talk a little bit actually about running back, something else you had mentioned earlier that I wanted to get back to. like running backs cheaper than Jordan Mason they could potentially hit. And there's actually a pretty long list of guys. You have David Montgomery, Rashid White, Tony Pollard, Zach Charbonnet. I'm just reading off the list. Aaron Jones, Jerome Ford, skipping a little bit, DeAndre Swift, Zamir White. I wanted to ask you about Cleveland running backs, which is a little bit random, but they are Cleveland's a pretty big favorite. They're 6.5-point favorite, and I don't know that they're necessarily going to need the passing game again. This could be a defense and running game. And I mentioned Jerome Ford last week, and you were like, yeah, but Dante Foreman. And that's actually a really interesting, because he ended up getting a lot of the work.
14 carries and 1 target, right? I mean, that's right off of Jordan Mason's workload last week.
Yeah, and Foreman is only 4,400. He's a big home favorite that's getting increasing work, and I feel like that's a sneaky play. It's the kind of play that I rarely tag, rarely mention. I want to mention him, or do you think it's like Jerome Ford, or should we go back to Jerome Ford?
No. I mean, I think it's super sharp. I mean, I think that's how teams use Deontay Foreman, right? And then he just completely disappears, or he's even a healthy scratch for some games, and then he's active and he rushes for 100 yards and a touchdown on 22 carries, just running dudes over. And at 4,400, he kind of gets down into this. There's Charbonnet and Mason are so cheap for their roles that it's kind of hard to if Foreman were 5,300, you'd be like, I can find the extra $700, right? But when you get down to 4,400, you kind of start getting down into this range where a wide receiver, you're looking at Jalen Naylor and you're looking at Jalen Tolbert and kind of these types of guys where it's doesn't Deontay Foreman have the same low floor as those guys, but also as high of a ceiling or higher of a ceiling? So I think that it's viable. I remember it was a couple of years ago where you would see some rosters from Big T where it was just whatever was the cheapest running back with a role that he could find, because then he's also able to fit in Justin Jefferson and Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams, right? And it's passing was still winning in the NFL, and running those split backfields, and the pricing ended just on running backs, and it was so sharp to just be let me get as many of these high priced wide receivers as I can. Now things have changed where things are tilting over towards the running backs, and the wide receivers are starting to be overpriced, but still there's value in this thought of as opposed to thinking so positionally, just thinking, where am I saving salary? And I mean, what am I getting for the salary I'm saving? And so, I mean, I think that's another spot where it makes sense to consider Deontay Foreman down here. As if he misses, so does Jalen Naylor most times we play at the slate. So does Jalen Tolbert most of the times we play at the slate. But if he hits, so does Roma Dunze's 4,200, right? But he doesn't seem healthy. Didn't last week at least, and Caleb Williams still doesn't look right. And I mean, I think Deontay Foreman is kind of in that bucket of, hey, there's no real 3K guys. There's a couple 3K guys, but there's not really any strong 3K guys. And maybe let's just throw a dart at one of these cheaper guys and hope we hit.
So I guess one more running back situation, kind of murky situation, because somebody that's just a little bit cheaper than Jordan Mason, Rashad White, in a similar situation where Tampa Bay is a pretty good favorite. They might be running the ball, but somebody that's a lot cheaper than Jordan Mason is Bucky Irving. And I remember when Rashad White was the young, efficient running back behind Leonard Fournette that everybody was clamoring, we need more Rashad White. Now it's, the tables have turned. And Bucky Irving looks much more efficient out there. He seems to break off a long run. I'm going to, sometimes just sitting here watching the games, oh, good, Rashad White broke a pretty good, it's Bucky Irving again. Any thoughts on that situation? Is the Tampa Bay backfield somewhere you would consider going this week?
Yeah, I think for me, what I'm looking at is the 20 touches for Pollard, 20 touches with pass game work for Charbonnet, 25 touches I would project for Mason, 18 touches with goal line work for David Montgomery in a really good game environment with nobody on him, and he's great leverage off of all these other higher owned Lions pieces. I have a hard time with pricing still loose enough at running back to going. What are the chances that Irving gets 20 plus points? It seems really thin. And then even if he does, there's probably lots of other running backs priced close to him that are also getting 20 points. So I don't see the edge there, but he's getting close enough to that Deontay Foreman price range that you're maybe if I really need the savings, I don't think I'll go there myself, but I definitely see the case. He's a guy I've looked at and be what about this?
All right. Doesn't sound like you're dying to go there. But are you or someone you know dying to go to the Taylor Swift Eras Tour? Play our free to play game every week for a chance to win 2 tickets and a trip to Vancouver. Check out the link in the description to play and watch the short video at the end of our show for more info. So I do think we should spend some time talking about quarterbacks. You mentioned Geno Smith. I was really surprised to see him with like the highest ownership projection on the week. Like, because I was, just looking through the slate before I, looked at projections or ownership or anything. And it's like, oh, there's some clear games I want to target. And then it's like, oh, there's, the quarterbacks are actually like priced kind of in a challenging way. Like there's high priced quarterbacks that have some upside, in the rushing game. Like you could, it's tempting to try to, get up to Lamar Jackson, to Jalen Hurts. Kyler Murray is, I guess, the fourth most expensive quarterback on the slate. And then I was like, oh, like Derek Carr is only 5,800. That's probably like the most, in my mind, the most underpriced quarterback this week. And then I looked at ownership projections. Geno Smith is $200 cheaper, is projected for almost twice the ownership of Carr. I guess like thoughts, and that's like kind of an interesting game, Seattle and Miami, because I think Devin Achane will see a lot of ownership, and Tyreek Hill is going to see almost no ownership. I guess any thoughts on Geno Smith, Seattle, and then also like Miami, Skylar Thompson and crew. I have no idea how that game's going to play out.
I'm not going to play any Geno. I'm not going to waste time arguing against him because like most of the time he's going to score 17 to 22 points. And I think that's perfectly solid. I don't like NFL teams aren't just trying to pile up stats. You know what I mean? They're trying to win games. And so unless you think that the Dolphins are scoring a lot of points, I don't see the justification for Geno having to like throw a ton and have this big game. Even like DK Metcalf drawing all this ownership, right? Like if people saw 13 targets and 15 DraftKings points last week, they wouldn't be clamoring to play him. They're clamoring to play him because he had a 56-yard touchdown that he gets the catch, the 56 yards, the touchdown, the 100-yard bonus that puts him all the way up to 31 points. And that wasn't like that was a busted coverage where Kyle Duggar and Christian Gonzalez had miscommunication, and neither of them ran with DK Metcalf, so he just ran by himself and was wide open. Like that's not repeatable, right? I mean, he can hit plays like that, but it's just funny how the recency bias plays with people in DFS. And I'm so far outside of that box because I'm like doing all the game research and teams and all that, and like trying to figure out what's going to happen this week. And then I poke my head up on like Thursday night or Friday and look at ownership projections, and it's like, oh my gosh, people really just look at recent box scores. And I mean, like Marvin Harrison last week, it was just so obvious to me that he was a sharp play, and I was like, oh, and he's going to be 2% owned, which is why like a lot of times being contrarian isn't about trying to like find the guy nobody's on. It's just about like finding who you like and then looking and be like, oh, here's the ones that I really like that people aren't on. Let me find ways to emphasize that. So I don't think these guys are bad plays. I just don't see the justification for them being high owned, and they're not in my pool, not because of strategy, but just because I don't see that being the clearest path to winning a tournament. The Dolphins side, if we had value, I'd play Tyreek Hill as like us, hey, sneaky, maybe, but like he only topped like 32 or 33 points once last year in a shootout with Tua. Like, I don't think he's getting to 40 points, with Skylar Thompson, and then there's no value available this week. So I always try to ask myself, like when I completely cross guy off my list, like, am I okay if this guy beats me? And my answer is yes. Just because I think it's such a thin proposition, but also like in large field play, you could be like, oh, 3% Tyreek Hill, I'll be even with the field or above the field. So I don't think I think that's still sharp, but it's just one of those guys that whole game is kind of outside of Achane, who I'll always be happy to play. I think he's still sharp, but the running backs, Achane and Charbonnet, but I'm kind of leaving the rest of that game alone.
Yeah, I see it the same way. It seems like a game that could hit its total, but probably not exceed it by much. And I think like Geno Smith probably is going to hit his like median projection. I think it's like a median projection thing where I would be shocked if like Seattle gets shut out, right? Like Seattle's going to score some points. I just don't see them as being like the highest scoring team at the end of the day, unless like the Dolphins really surprise and are able to like to push them. I just think that like Geno is too cheap for a quarterback that's going to score some points. So it's like a good cash game play. Tyreek Hill, like I will certainly. This is why I do like large field multi-entry. This is like single entry. Like I don't think Tyreek Hill is a single entry play this week, but I do think that I'll have a handful of Tyreek Hill rosters. If he does take like an end arounds and goes, for 80 yards twice, that I still have something to root for. As I'm following football on Sunday. I think that's situation is that whole game is like very much diminished by the lack of Tua. So I think it's an unfortunate situation because I had really high hopes for the Dolphins offense this season, but it's probably not going to happen at least for this game. I guess one more game I want to touch on a little bit more that we'd mentioned. 'Cause for me, it's kind of a fourth game that I think may not see a ton of ownership, but I could easily be the top game. I think by the end of the week is the Houston and Minnesota game. I was thinking that it's a game that's actually, I guess it has like the Joe Mixon injury factor, but other than that, like not ravaged by a bunch of injuries. But like we've had one of the best offenses in the NFL going into a dome, like on the road. They are on the road, which doesn't help. Being in a dome does help. It should be a close game. I know I'm fascinated by the idea of maybe playing some like CJ Stroud and Tank Dell is really underpriced, I think. And I think he's one of those 5,000 wide receivers at 5,200. And like, I think Justin Jefferson might be the expensive wide receiver I'm most like apt to get up to because I think you could play like a CJ Stroud, Tank Dell, Justin Jefferson stack. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we like the Texans offense so much that like we as a community overrate the frequency at which they score like 30 plus points. They're not like a super high scoring team and they're a really competitive defense. But and then that Minnesota scheme, and this is all like you can get so deep into the weeds trying to figure these things out that like you can't zoom out as easily and just be like, yeah, but also this other thing could happen. But I do think the Brian Flores scheme or lack of scheme is uniquely equipped to stop the Shanahan style offense, which is something I talked about over the last couple of weeks and why that's the case. But the very short of it is that, the Shanahan defense is all about like offense all about we understand the defense's rules and we know how to manipulate those rules to break those rules and like get guys wide open. And then Brian Flores doesn't have rules. So then they just have to run their offense. And Brian Flores is able to be like, we know the offense's rules and we're going to manipulate that. And like, we're going to put guys here so that the quarterback thinks that he's supposed to go here, but then we're going to have a guy in that space, And so it's like, it just causes the quarterback to constantly hold the ball an extra second. I did hear like one person said, maybe it won't matter for CJ Stroud because he doesn't think. He just like instinctively sees everything and reacts. But yeah, it's not like the best matchup for any team on either side of the ball. But I do have it as kind of like my fourth game, same as you said, right? Like I'm going to have some Darnold and Justin Jefferson and Nico, and maybe play it some other ways. But yeah, it's definitely a tier below the other ones. I think a lot would have to go right for that to be the game that wins you a tournament, but it's like more within the range of outcomes than the other 8 games, so that's definitely in the mix for me.
Interesting. All right. Yeah. I thought it'd be a little bit higher on the Texans, but I think what you're saying makes sense. Definitely worth listening to. And don't forget to join in the fun each week with the RG's Listener League and play alongside other viewers as well as your favorite hosts. You'll have a chance every week to compete for first place and win yourself a month of RG Combo Premium. Check out our description for an invite to the contest. So I guess, yeah, I see it, kind of still see it as like there's probably like 3 or 4 spots, I want to get to. Probably going to stack, probably have some secondary stacks. And I think for single entry, I am probably going to be focusing on those, the games that we kind of highlighted, the Cardinals and Detroit. I think New Orleans and Dallas. And, I think Minnesota and Houston is, another one, and then New Orleans and Philly. Any final thoughts on the week?
Think about for those of you watching, listening, think about ceiling and think about those guys who can like smash their salary considered upside, because again, just value is so thin that if you get that 3.5, if you get that 30 pointer from the 8.4K guy, 8.9K guy, like it's not going to have the same value as it would in a typical week, unless you somehow uncover a cheap guy who also puts up 20. I think in the mid-range is going to be a strong way to build, but there's also other ways to go about it. But you got to think about like who can truly separate. I think we did a good job at the top of the show covering why that's the case. So definitely think about that if you're trying to win a tournament this week.
Great, it's a lot to think about. That'll do it for week 3, and we'll see you guys next week.
Don't let the Chads, Brads, and Dads have all the fun this football season with their parlays and their fantasy team. You can have fun too by playing Tix Pick 6, and you'll have a chance to win a trip for two to the Eras Tour in Vancouver. And the best part, it's totally free. So here's the deal. Each week, you'll make 6 picks. 2 of them will be about Taylor, like who's going to be in the suite with her that game. The other 4 will be about the Chiefs game, and it's designed to teach you the basics of sports betting. So who will cover the spread, or will Travis score a touchdown? You earn points for every right answer, and those points turn into entries into the grand prize drawing. You can win up to 13 points a week. Don't know anything about sports betting? Don't worry. I've got you. Each week I break it all down in a preview article so you can make more informed choices. You must be 21 plus and in the US to enter. For more, check out tixpick6.actionnetwork.com.